Guess we'll start. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's an honor to introduce Radhika Nagpal. So there's lots of things to say, so I don't know how you want to split this, 30 minutes and 30 minutes. So Radhika is the Kafli Professor of Computer Science of if you take the river upstream, did you find another university? So it's from that place over there, from Harvard. So Radhika has won many awards, Microsoft Fellowship, Radcliffe Fellowship, NSF Award. Is nominated one of the top 10 most influential scientists and engineers by Nature in 2014. She works on bottom-up, or is interested in bottom-up organization in biological systems and see how that sort of gets translated to robot systems. So she's not only concerned about the computational and algorithmic and communication aspects of how to make that work, but also the physical constraints of how do you get a physical device to implement those algorithms. With all the constraints that come with it. So she has sort of shown great examples inspired by cells, by ants, by termites, by fish schools, lots of physical swarms that generate complex behavior. So
he gave my talk.
There you go. I told you. Anyway, bottom-up emergence of intelligence to some degree, right? And as you know, I always like to finish with something slightly different on the side. Maybe in this case, I want to share a personal story. So my son, Leo, he's 5 years old, and he's super interested in robots. Like, that's his thing always. And I had been looking for how we can sort of I can interact with him to teach him how to code. And we have this robot at home, which is called Root, which it turns out I discovered recently that it comes from a company that Radhika started some time ago. And I also learned very recently that that company started sort of shipping the first robots in 2018, but not too long ago was acquired by iRobot, which is fantastic news, right? So. Somehow Radhika makes it happen so that you can do all those things, being successful at every single level, including starting a company and being acquired, and surviving through that process. Finally, I guess she probably has some kind of trick to make that happen, which might be the reason that led her to write a very famous blog article in Scientific American. What year was it?
2013.
2013.
That was a long time
which
ago.
is called if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. I've read it many, many times. It's called the Awesomest 7-Year Postdoc, referring to the tenure process and how sort of manage all the expectations and all the stress that comes from having to navigate that process of having to do 100 different things at the same time. So thank you very much for that.
Now I feel super nervous. Thank you, Aurora. That was very sweet, and I'm really excited that that you're playing with Root. I'm sure your child is also playing with Root, but I don't know who's playing more with Root, because like the parents are apparently our biggest market. All right. So to hear somebody give you an introduction like that, it's very good for imposter syndrome. So I'm going to try to get over that as I start my talk. So what I work on is collective intelligence. I'm a computer scientist and I'm a roboticist. And the theme that my whole lab works on is collective intelligence. So the idea that how is it that very large number of individuals with simple interactions with each other can exhibit a level of intelligence that is much more than what the individuals themselves have. All right. So what does it mean for a computer scientist and a roboticist to work on collective intelligence? Well, these days it means something like this. So this is me on my 45th birthday, trekking 10 miles a day in 90-degree weather in Panama hunting army ants. So army ants are this amazing example of collective behavior. Millions of them live together. They build their entire nest out of their bodies. And they create these trails to gather food. And the amazing thing is there's just no leader in charge. And they create these crazy bridge structures to get over any kind of terrain that they don't like. So it's really quite amazing. So army ants, of course, are an example of collective intelligence in a way that we would like to emulate. But they're not the only example you could think of. So you can also think of cells as having collective intelligence. So every little cell has an identical DNA program, and yet as a group, they create complex structure, from fruit flies to ourselves, even structures that can repair. So this is an example of a starfish, but here's an example of a starfish regenerating its body from a leg. So it's just amazing how much regeneration can happen. Collective intelligence can also operate at really large scales. So tiny termites build these mounds that are meters high when the insects themselves are only centimeters scale. How is that even possible for individuals at that level to cooperate? And if you go even bigger sizes, you can think of fish schools and bird flocks. And here you start to see even more amazing structures, structures that are in motion, moving and changing and even creating these bait ball-like structures. So I mean, all of these examples that I showed you, we think of as collective intelligence. And I think for an engineer or a biologist, they're incredibly fascinating. And actually for any person, these systems are fascinating. And I think one of the reasons we find them so fascinating is that when we look at them, each individual is so tiny compared to the phenomenon that they are part of, that they are generating. And it seems almost mind-boggling that they could coordinate at all when each individual has such a local view, couldn't possibly know what somebody is doing all the way across. But they do coordinate really well, and they do create these incredible structures and exhibits of intelligence. And what I find most remarkable is that in addition to the fact that that's true, we also know that these systems don't operate based on leaders. So there isn't a professor in charge of the classroom, there isn't a university president, there isn't a president of the country. As you can see, there are lots of problems with all of these issues when you put somebody in charge. Well, these systems have no one in charge. These systems have no one in charge. So how is it that they operate? And it seems that they operate through rules that individuals use with each other, and that somehow the multiplication of these rules is generating the intelligence. So, of course, as a biologist, you want to understand these rules because that's what science is about. It's like, how do these systems work? But as an engineer, of course, your immediate reaction is, how can I build my own? So if this is intelligence, how do we create our own version of AI? How do we create collective intelligence? Could we mass manufacture very simple individuals and rules and have systems work in this fashion? And there are lots of reasons why we might want to do this. So if you think of any application where there's robotics, whether you're thinking of agriculture, or you're thinking of search and rescue, or you're thinking of construction or environmental monitoring, these are all cases where you're going to use lots of robots. You're not going to use one robot. Even if you think about self-driving cars, right, that's going to be a lot of robots on the road. So we want to be able to know how to program these systems with large numbers of individuals, how to program them such that we have really good coherent behavior and not maybe pathological behavior. And for me, personally, I'm also, in addition to thinking about the applications area, I'm also just really interested in how this kind of complexity arises. So what are the principles by which these kinds of systems work? Are there universal principles that you would see regardless of scales, that you would see they would work in cells and in ants and fish and in birds and in robots? Are there just some ideas that work across all scales? And could we discover what those principles are? And so for me, building robots is both about trying to think about these future application areas, but also just trying to understand the fundamental science behind complexity. How do these complex systems work? So today, what I'm going to do is tell you about 4 projects from my group that strategically are exactly based on the 4 systems that I showed you videos of. And the thing that's common about these 4 examples of collective intelligence is that in all of these cases, the group is creating some kind of structure. So in the case of cells, we can think about how can agents work together to create precise and global structure when nobody else is in charge. If we're thinking about termites that build mounds, we can think about how can individuals build three-dimensional structures much larger than themselves. And when we think about army ants, we can think about adaptive structures. How can individuals problem solve by building structures in their environment without knowing ahead of time what they need to do? And then when we think of fish schools, we'll think of structure that isn't just structure, but it's dynamic structure. So structure and motion all wrapped up together. So these are all sort of examples that have to do with structure, but also have to do with collectives that are engaging and doing it without any leaders. All right. So, so let's start with cells. I always try to remind myself to set a timer because I'm afraid, but I just forgot again. OK, so if I'm off time, that will explain it. OK, so thinking about cells, as I mentioned before, cells have identical DNA, and they're working together to create this complex structure. So imagine if we could do that, right? What if you could give me a shape that you wanted a structure build? I send it through a compiler. It produces a DNA. I feed this DNA to robotic cells, and poof, the robotic cells self-organize to create the structure. And of course, this is what all science fiction movies have made of. If you've watched Big Hero 6, you saw the millibots. You've seen this many, many times. They usually go bad in some way and destroy the world. So I'm a little worried about working on this area, but I'm hoping that it will be more like programmable materials. But really, the whole field of programmable materials is inspired by this idea that eventually we would be able to create something as powerful as a cell and be able to program it, and it would be able to create complex structure. So this is what motivated a project in my group called the Kilobot Project. And the idea behind the Kilobot Project was exactly that. First, can I create a compiler where you give me a global goal that you want a system to achieve, and I put it through this compiler, and out comes the program that an individual cell will run? And then can I have 1,000 cells, 1,000 robotic cells, that actually run that program and achieve the thing that we thought it should be able to achieve? What would it take to actually try to create that system? And the kilobots was an example of trying to create that system. And each robotic cell is very simple. It has, the idea is that it should have just the basics that you would expect: movement, communication, and the ability to program it, but only the ability to sense robots that are near it. And then 1,000 of them have to work together. All right, so this is a little bit of what it looks like. And the robot is about this size. So it has 2 vibration motors, and that's how it moves. But you can think of them really as wheels. So if you run both, it moves together. It can turn left. It can turn right. It can talk with other robots by reflecting light off of the bottom surface. And it can both measure distance from other robots, and it can also communicate messages with them. So once you just have those basic qualities, you can actually program a whole kinds of classic collective behaviors. So for example, synchronization. So fireflies synchronize. Here, every individual has an oscillator, but it looks at its neighbors, and it starts to synchronize with its neighbors, which causes them all to synchronize eventually. You can also program pattern formation. So we can program time. We can program pattern formation. If you think of stripes in a fruit fly. Here, we can program motion. So here, they're moving towards a light. I think the key thing to take away from these is that these are all collective behaviors that we sort of understand theoretically, and then we can sort of work on them with this physical system. And one of the things that you see very quickly is that our physical system has the kind of variability and complexity that you might imagine natural systems would have. You give them the same program, they don't quite run it the same way. So one of the first things that my group has worked on in this area is trying to think about a library of collective behaviors. So what are the different kinds of collective behaviors that you would need so that you could program a system to do different things? And so one of our key focuses, many of the pieces of this library are bio-inspired. So things that you would see cells do or see organisms do. But there are also some classic distributed algorithms that we program too, like localization and position control. And so we built up this library with a lot of emphasis on closing the gap between theoretical models and the physical systems. What are the kinds of errors and phenomena that you see that you wouldn't have seen, that you wouldn't have realized if you hadn't a physical system? All right. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this library, but I want to talk about what do you do if you have this library. Suppose I gave you this library of collective behaviors, and you said, well, coming back to your original goal, what I really want is to create some complex shape. So maybe the idea would be, can your robotic cells form some complex shape for me, like the shape of a starfish, which is not really that complicated since I'm ignoring all of the internals of the starfish and just thinking about the shape. Is there some sort of compiler where I put the shape in, and you actually take all of these pieces from your library and you compose them, and you can give me back a program that does the thing I want? So here's an example. I'll show you 2 examples of doing that. So it's not that you can only do this one way. There's actually multiple ways you can compose these behaviors to achieve the same global goal. So the first example I'll show you we call directed growth. So the idea is if you think of like a plant growing or something, you're sort of adding layer after layer. So we start with a group of robots. There's a seed, which is basically where the thing is going to grow from, and you're just growing outwards from layers. And in this system, we're using a couple of different, I put sort of some of the library ones here. We're using gradients or sort of stripe formation to think about layers. We're using positional information so that individuals know where they are as they grow. And there's a lot of edge following, as you'll see, which is basically how robots are going to get to where they are. So this is what this composition looks like. So that's Mike Rubinstein, who designed the Kilobot robots. From the speed of his moment, you can see that this is very sped up. But the important thing to notice here is that each individual robot actually only is able to talk to at most 20 robots in its neighborhood. It has no idea what's happening further and further away. So each robot is sort of going around the shape, looking for a place to make the system grow, and the system is just growing layer by layer. And in fact, every time you run the system, you actually get a slightly different version. So here we ran a rectangle like multiple times, and it's almost like fingerprints. You know, the internal and the noise will produce many different shapes, but you can actually get a global coherent behavior. And you can actually do this for many shapes. So many different kinds of self-assembly can be done with this algorithm. OK, so that's the first way I could compose some of these behaviors. I used some pattern formation, some movement like edge following. But there's other ways you can also think about building things. So you could think about not building things additively, but maybe building things subtractively. So imagine a different program where I took all of my robotic cells and I shaved away the parts that I didn't want, right? So now I'm actually doing it by disassembly. And this is also pattern formation and uses motion. So here's an example of what this program will look like. So we start all of the kilobots together, and you can sort of see that they are starting to talk to each other and form a shape. It doesn't all happen at the same time. And as they form a shape, eventually they actually have to come to consensus. So the whole group comes to consensus and decides that they are done with that phase, and then they move to another phase, and it's like a star exploding. So all of the robots that are not part of the shape are basically moving away from the light and getting removed. So this is a really different way of making a shape. One of the big differences between the first and the second is that the first sped up video was 12 hours, and this video was 30 minutes. So there's one algorithm can be really, really slower or faster than another. And this is just an example of different kinds of shapes that we can do, not all the same shapes. So I think I went a little fast. So with the Kilobot project, one of the things that we were able to demonstrate is that it is actually possible not only to create this library of behaviors, but also to create global to local compilers. So it is possible to think of structure as formed by many, many individuals. But in fact, how you decide to do that can have a really big impact. In one case, we used a very sort of growth-based idea. In one case, we used a subtractive idea. And one of the things we learned is that the subtractive idea doesn't require as much precise motion. And so not only is it faster, in some ways it's actually more robust. So as we think about systems with larger numbers of individuals, thinking about systems that are tolerant or sort of utilize the variability and randomness even better than we are doing before might be a better way of thinking about composing complex behavior than others. Nevertheless, the kinds of shapes that we can form in the system are still sort of limited. So for example, if you cut off the leg of this starfish, it can't really reorganize its cells to make the thing come back. But there's another group at Bristol, a former sort of lab affiliate, Sabine Hortz, who's a roboticist, and James Sharp, who's a biologist, and they're actually using Turing patterns to generate shapes. So in this case, it's an even more bottom-up approach, and in this case, if you actually cut off parts of the shape, it does actually reorganize. You still can't quite control the shape as well, but it actually has this ability of self-repair, again, coming from a very biological idea. And one of the things that I'm very proud about in this sort of one is that we were able to commercialize the kilobots. And so now, not only Sabine's lab actually has 1,000 robots, so we are no longer the only lab with 1,000 robots, but there are about a dozen other labs. And so there's a lot of different people who can now, all of us can share code and also share ideas about what are the things about collective behavior that we're interested in. So I talked mostly about self-assembly, but there's a lot of people working on consensus and search and all the kinds of other algorithms. So there's quite a few labs using kilobots now. All right. So the examples that I showed you thus far, we're really trying to do self-assembly in 2D. And there were a lot of individuals and working together. But what if you wanted to do self-assembly in 3D? What would you have to do? So termites are a great example of that. They're master architects. They build these skyscrapers that are so much larger than their own size. And the way that they do it is actually very interesting. So they make these mud pellets, and they stack up mud pellets to make pillars and roofs. And then they climb on top of that, and then they make more pillars and roofs. And then they climb on that, and they build more. So the idea is you climb, and you build, and you climb, and you build, and you climb. And suddenly you can build structures that are way larger than your own physical size. So this is a really amazing idea. The other sort of interesting thing about the termites is that, of course, the structure they're building is so much larger than the individuals. So you may not even meet other individuals in this system. So the other thing they discovered about termites is that they coordinate implicitly. So I might build something, and that influences what you might build later when you see it. And this communication through the environment is termed stigmergy. So this also allows a small group, which in this case is 1 million. 1 million is a small group, to work together over a huge area, even though they aren't constantly talking to each other, and they can't possibly be talking to one sort of central unit. OK, so we decided to sort of take these ideas and try to build our own system of robots that build. And of course, we thought we could do the same thing. So if we have these robots, and they have some sort of pellet or some sort of block that they can build from, then if they can climb over those blocks, then maybe they can build staircases. And they can build staircases to build a higher structure, and then more staircases to build a higher structure. And that way we can have robots build structures much larger than themselves. So we started working on this project. And then 2 years into the project, we were scooped by another computer science group. So I'm going to show you their video. This is the opening sequence of Walle. I don't know if you even noticed this one, but it has blocks, it has a tower, and it has a staircase going around this tower so it can build these high structures. I will say that my group was both like happy and unhappy with this video, because not only does Walle climb and build structures much larger than himself, he also makes those blocks out of found objects, which is the other part of, we can't still do. So anyways, yeah, Walle is every roboticist. Well, not every roboticist, but everybody in my lab loves Walle. All right, so this is our version of Walle, which took us a few more years. And you can see this robot is climbing over staircases, and it's carrying a block. And I won't have time to talk in too much detail about it, but the key thing is we were really interested in mechanical simplicity. How do you create a robot that through very simple interactions can do all of these complicated things? Climb, carry, put down a block, climb over the thing that it built, right? So all of these pieces together. But once you have all of those pieces together, we can actually program the group to behave in a way that's actually very similar to the kilobots. So you take a shape, you put it through this compiler, and it actually has a directed growth pattern. But you can think about growing in x, y, and also growing in the z dimension. So here, a robot comes to sort of the seed, the starting location. It walks around, so edge following, until it finds a place to build, and then it builds. And it's just sort of growing in layers in the x, y, and then also growing layers in z. And the only difference is that we have to have one sort of invariant in buildings so that there's always a staircase in the system. So you always locally have to keep things looking like staircases. Otherwise, the robot can't climb up straight walls. So this is showing a single robot running the full algorithm. So it comes to the starting place, it gets a block, and then it starts to build. And the interesting thing here is that we were actually able to create rules that have a little bit more self-repair. So if a mean person comes along, and that's Kirsten, who designed the robots, comes and destroys the structure for you, it actually doesn't matter because the robot doesn't actually have a concept of what has been built before. It doesn't have a memory. Every time it comes to the structure, it's building anew. So if some of the structure disappears, many times it can compensate. But if somebody comes and helps out, that's good too. And so now multiple robots can work together, but the structure itself is the entire memory, if that makes sense. So here you see 3 robots working together. The robots are not communicating with each other. They're just running the algorithm and just constantly working together. And we can prove that these rules, no matter what order in which they traverse the structure, or they traverse the structure in a particular order, that the rules will be non-conflicting. And I think that there's just a couple of takeaways I like from this is that one, the idea of self-assembly and collective construction and global to local compilers is not that different. This is really similar. But it is also very different in that we can use stigmergy. We can actually communicate through the environment. We can do things in 3D. And that's very different. So one of the open pieces is, this was a directed growth implementation. Is somebody going to make robots that can do the subtractive approach? So would it be possible to make a compiler where you start with a big block of stuff and the robots actually etch it out? And I always think of like Mines of Moria, just internal structure. But if you think about leafcutter ants, they build incredible underground nest structures. And so really, we could think of robots that build subtractively as well as constructively. And algorithmically, we would actually understand how to do this in all of these different settings. All right. So, so both of the examples that I showed you so far, the collectives were building something where we knew ahead of time what we wanted. So I told you that I wanted a starfish shape, or I told you that I wanted a tower. And we have this compiler that generates the program that individuals should run. So we're really thinking about global to local programming. But that's not the only kind of self-assembly that exists. There's also a lot of self-assembly that happens where you're reacting to the environment around you. So army ants are a really amazing example of this. They constantly build structures in their environment only to solve problems. So for example, they build these crazy kinds of bridge structures because there's rough and inefficient terrain and they want to get somewhere faster. And so they build these temporary structures throughout their lives to be able to solve problems in their environment. And of course, you can't know ahead of time what problems you're going to face in an environment, so you can't know ahead of time a blueprint of what it is you're going to build. Instead, somehow your self-assembly rule has to work in the context of the environment. So how is it that these individuals can work together to solve these kinds of problems in their environment? So I want to start by showing you a video of what it looks like to make such a bridge structure. Okay. And before I show you the video, I just want to give you a little bit of the setup. So the nest is over here to the right, and you'll see in red there's a long trail. There's a trail of ants that are carrying larvae. You'll see them carry white larvae. They're bringing back food to their nest. And there's a connected path, but it's kind of long and narrow and has this V-shaped detour. So from the left to the right. So what the ants have done is that they don't really want to take this detour. So instead, they've constructed a temporary bridge so that they can basically go straight across, right? This is like when you have a sidewalk that goes like this, and then people walk until you've removed the grass from here and created your own path. It's kind of like that, except they're suspended in air, and they've made it out of their own bodies, which of course is very different. Yeah. And so the other thing to notice here is, of course, they've straightened the path. It's also fairly wide, so they can actually support a decent amount of traffic. OK, so what I'm going to show you is what the formation process looks like, or rather the reformation process, because we're going to break it. All right, so we break it. They freak out. There's a lot of chaos. But one thing, I don't know why it's choppy. So some of the ants start going the long path, But you can see some of them, I don't know if you want to call them lazy or opportunistic, are trying to cross anyways. And a few big ones get across. But then suddenly there's a surge of traffic, and a lot of individuals are getting stepped on, and suddenly they're climbing over each other to get over on the other side. And very soon you see that the ones that are getting climbed over actually just stay where they are and become a bridge. And so now you have some set of individuals that are basically dedicated to crossing that gap and others crossing over them. And it's literally 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes. It's like we did nothing. This thing repairs so fast. It's like you couldn't even tell that we actually destroyed the bridge. So this is a really sort of cool kind of self-assembly. And there's two things about it that I wanted to highlight that I think are really interesting. The first one is that, of course, the shape of the bridge is going to have to be related to the gap, right? So it has to be related to the geometry. But it turns out it's also related to the traffic. So a colleague of mine, Simone Garnier, who's a biologist, has studied these kind of bridges both in natural settings and in artificial settings. So here they're sort of creating an artificial detour. And what they found is that if there's very low traffic, then all of the individuals will just take the long route. But if the traffic gets high, then these bridges start to form. And the size of the bridge is related to how much traffic there is. So the more traffic and congestion there is, a wider bridge forms to basically take care of that traffic. So if you think about like sustainable architecture, right? You have a resource, it grows when you need more of it, and then it actually shrinks. So if the traffic dies down, or if the mean biologist stops the traffic, then actually the ants that are in the bridge will get up and leave. And so the bridge they will go back to their normal lives. And so this is a self-assembly that can both grow with need, decrease, and dissolve all with one rule. And of course, this all has to somehow work with one single rule. You can't have a different rule for every different situation that you encounter. It somehow has to work for all. So that's one really interesting thing about this self-assembly is it's very adaptive and dynamic. The other interesting thing about this sort of self-assembly is that the structures formed are really not what you would think of as a good bridge. Right? They're not trying to make a truss structure or a lattice structure. It's actually a very inefficient structure because there's just so much material in it. So the ants are just attaching to each other in a very amorphous and messy way. But there are also some advantages to that. One advantage is that it's very fast. So the ants are very imprecisely able to connect to each other, and they don't have to reason too much about the structure. So in this imprecise way, they're connecting with each other, and they're really fast. And then the structure itself has compliance, because the individual ants, their bodies are flexible. And so in fact, this bridge can fit into all kinds of messy situations and unstructured environment, which is where that they have to solve these problems. So there's sort of two games being played here. There's the sort of game of, what is the computation and the collective behavior, but there's also the mechanical structure, which is really lending itself to doing self-assembly in this environment. So inspired by these bridges we have a project in the lab, and this is sort of work in progress. Both of the two that I'll show now is like half-baked, half-published pieces. Is the Eceton, we call it the Eceton Robotica project. And the idea is that we want to introduce another species into this genus, except it will be a robotic species. And our goal is to hit those two highlights that I said before. So first of all, can we design a robot swarm where individual robots can move, but then when the need arises, they can self-assemble, and self-assemble some sort of amorphous and quick structure. So most of the work that's been done in the area of self-reconfigurable robots has been focused on very rigid robots that connect in very lattice-like structures. So here we're saying, instead, what if we had soft robots and they could connect to anywhere else on any body? Can we still reason about this system when we've given up all of our understanding of lattices? So that's the first part. And then the second part is, how do we create self-assembly rules that have this property of being adaptive and dynamic? And here we can actually take inspiration from what people think the ants are doing, which is that they are somehow reacting to congestion as a signal to create structure, and lack of congestion as a signal to dissolve structure. And that maybe that is a sufficient rule to produce collectively a behavior that seems really intelligent. All right, so I'll first show you a video of where we are on the robot side. So this is Melinda, who's a mechanical engineering student and who's the lead on this project. And this is the robot in its native habitat. I'm not really sure, but it's like getting very choppy. All right. So the robot is smoother than this movie, if that helps. All right, so the robot has a soft body. This is actually roughly the size of the body. It has 2 cables, and it moves by bending. And so it's a bipedal with a very simple thing. It's one foot. You turn it over. When the foot hits something, it grabs, and then you flip the body over. So it's just moving by flipping. Okay. And the grippers that we have grab into Velcro or foam surfaces. So they have a little coil, and the coil sort of digs into the foam or into the loops, and then you unwind it and it can let go. So it has some nice self-aligning properties. All right. So the control for this robot is really simple. You flip over your foot. When your foot hits something, it has proximity sensors. You grab, and then you flip over your body again. And that's the entire control. But with just this control, it can actually move in any orientation and also deal with even different angles. And this is where the soft body is really important, because the grippers might hit in different orientations, but the body just absorbs the orientations and sort of deforms to the situation. So we can have a robot that's quite good at climbing. And then the next step is, of course, to make the robot climb over other robots. And the way that we do that is we cover the robots in Velcro. So the robots are covered in stretchable Velcro. And now a robot can climb over another robot. And the important thing is it can attach anywhere along the body of the robot in order to climb over it. So we're still working on making these robots more easier to manufacture. But the nice thing is that already they're untethered and fully autonomous and can basically autonomously climb over each other to create these soft structures. So the next step is, how do we take this robot that can climb over each other, and can they start to create these dynamic structures? So since we only have 2 robots, we built a simulator to investigate different kinds of rules. And our simulator has a simplified version of the robot. So instead of modeling all of the softness of the robot, which, as most of you probably know, is computationally pretty intractable, we have an abstract model that has 2 grippers, that move by flipping. And when the gripper hits a surface, it makes a compliant joint. And that's sort of how we're modeling that the robot body can move and has a little bit of compliance. And then for thinking about bridges and terrains, we decided to look at this V-detour problem, since it's one of the cases where there's a lot of good data on what ants are doing. And so we have a V-terrain, and the idea is, do you or do you not form bridges in this surface? All right. So what is the rule that an individual robot should use in order to decide whether or not to make a bridge? So I'm going to show you one, which is just a hypothesis that biologists have about how ants might be deciding to do this. So the idea is that an ant is in one of 2 states. Either it's in a moving state where it's just moving along, or it can be in a bridge state where it's stationary. And the way you end up in a bridge state is that somebody bumped into you or tried to climb over you. So as soon as somebody tries to climb over you, or you're bumping into a lot of individuals, you basically will become stationary. And you'll stay stationary for a while, and then if nothing is happening anymore, nobody's grabbing you, nobody's climbing over you, then you'll go back to your moving state. So it's a very simple program, just moving state, bridge state, moving state, bridge state. Okay. The interesting thing is, what is the implication when everybody is running this rule together? So the idea is that for a collective, one implication might be that bridge self-assembly is actually self-stabilizing. So the idea sort of goes like this, or the hypothesis goes like this. If you have a lot of congestion, then everybody will start bumping into each other. Because they bump into each other, they'll start forming a bridge. However, the bridge itself will actually smooth out the traffic, causing people no longer to bump into each other. And thus, we will end up with a bridge, and we'll end up with smooth traffic. So the bridge will grow to meet the need, and then it will self-stabilize. It's a very nice hypothesis without proof. And the other piece of this is that the size of the bridge will be a function of congestion. So the more congestion there is, the bigger bridge you'll get. And you might get congestion because your path is really narrow, or you might get congestion because there's just a lot of traffic. So both terrain and traffic are going to determine the shape and the size of the bridge you get. And the second part of the hypothesis, which is related to the bottom arrow, is that if the traffic stops, the bridge will disassemble. So if all of these robots are in bridge straight and I stop the traffic, then some of these ants will be able to leave if they're on the edge. And when they leave, they'll expose other ants on the edge, which will then leave, and then all of a sudden you're left with nothing. All right, so we decided to basically implement this in our simulated robots and see, and I'll show you, we actually get pretty much the behavior that the biologists hypothesized. So here's what it looks like. So here we're in low traffic. So for the most part, things are going well, but once in a while there's a collision in static traffic. And now this little bridge forms, and after this point, it actually is pretty stable. Like there's no congestion anymore. We sort of cut off the bad part of the terrain. When the traffic gets higher, it gets a little messier. You start to see a lot more collisions. You start to see all kinds of crazy bridge formations form. But for periods of time, the bridge actually stabilizes. And then there might be sort of a little bit more. But typically, you get a stable bridge. All right, so now we're going to stop the traffic. It's really fun to watch this thing dissolve because there are some trapped robots. And the order in which the disassembly happens is also not totally obvious because we have this few robots that are just stuck in places. But actually, mostly, except for a few edge cases, most of the bridge actually dissolves when you stop the traffic. These two are stuck. It's a longer story why we have a few dissolution cases. So the fun part is that this rule is not really specific to V-shaped bridges. You could actually imagine more complex terrains. And what's really happening is whenever there's congestion, you're forming these temporary structures to try and smooth the traffic. And then if the traffic is not there, those pieces will dissolve. And so we think that this rule can actually be used in many different settings beyond just thinking about bridging. And it's true that army ants actually create a whole bunch of structures. All right. So this is where we currently are on this project. And we're looking sort of at this phase space of terrain versus traffic. And you see regions of stability. You see regions where no bridge forms, if it's very low traffic or an easy terrain. But you also see some instability. So it's also cases where you have a pileup. And this was even observed with army ants as well. One of the things that I think is sort of the open question is whether other kinds of structures that army ants create adaptively also have the same kind of rule. So army ants, for example, create towers, and they create chains to reach objects that they can't access. There are also different kinds of ants that create cantilevers. And the question is, are all of these structures essentially the same kind of structures? Like if you remove the object, they dissolve, and do they form adaptively? And if so, like what would you change about the current rule, which is already pretty simple, to get these kind of adaptive structures? And that's something that we're working on now. But it is interesting that such a simple behavior can actually have such a complex outcome. All right, so the last project that I'm going to show you, which sort of in the investigation of structure, is thinking about structure that also involves motion. So how is it that collectives can work together while moving to create structure? And fish schools are, of course, the single most impressive example of that, in my opinion. Birds are pretty cool, too, but I love fish. I love snorkeling. And fish do all kinds of amazing things. So they can disperse in a really complicated environment without losing coherence in the collective when they're sort of foraging. They can align and migrate incredible distances together in incredibly large groups. But then they can also create dynamic structures to evade predators or to appear larger than themselves in order to scare off predators or even to capture other prey. Like this bait ball is an example where they're sort of rotating in a structure. And so there's really these beautiful kinds of structures that can be formed. And what's interesting about fish schools is that unlike the other examples that I showed you, for example, with termites or cells, or especially army ants, unlike all of those cases, there's actually quite a bit known about what rules fish use in order to create these structures. And in the 1980s, a computer graphics person, Craig Reynolds, created this really popular model based on the experimental data from fish schooling to describe how a group could collectively work together. And it depended on three basic behaviors. So attraction, repulsion, and alignment. So the idea with attraction is that a fish doesn't like to be separated from the group, so it tries to move to the centroid or nearby to the neighbors that it can observe. Similarly, it doesn't like to really collide into them either, so it's also repulsed. So it's going to move closer to the centroid of the group, but it doesn't want to be close to any particular individual so that it doesn't collide. So that's attraction and repulsion. And alignment would be that I also align my heading so that we're all moving in the same direction. So when you put these three pieces together, Craig Reynolds showed that you could create really beautiful computer graphics of group behavior that to people looked exactly like the natural system. And what's interesting is people after that showed that by using different amounts of these behaviors, you could actually produce all these different kind of behaviors. So for example, if you don't have alignment, you can produce something like shoaling. If you have alignment, then it turns into something like migrating. And there's actually a version where you combine these three and it starts to rotate on itself. And you can actually get bait balls. So just from these three different behaviors, you can actually program a whole bunch of dynamic behaviors from the group. The other interesting thing about these three behaviors is that there's no direct communication between individuals. So there's no identity in the system. There's no passing a message into the system. So we call it implicit coordination. I'm going to make all of my decisions only by observing other members in the collective who are near to me, and they're going to observe somebody else, and that's how the information is going to propagate. And of course, underwater, this is really good because it's much harder to create systems that are passing complicated signals underwater, but if you could do it all based on vision, then in fact you could create all of these complex behaviors without having to pass messages. So, so using those rules, so if we take all of the things that we can do from the Boyd's model, all of these different kind of dynamic behaviors, and then you add to it some of the collective library behaviors that I talked about before, like sync or gradients or quorum sensing, then in fact already you can imagine writing a programming language for a fish-like system that's really very powerful, where you could use a programming language to express a complicated mission that you want this group to do, and it would be composed from all of these pieces. And so that part is already ready and sort of ready to go. The problem is that implementing these systems has been really hard. And part of it is, even though these rules are very simple, they assume a perfect fish that moves in perfect 3D and has perfect three-dimensional sensing of all of its neighbors. And even real fish can't do that. So even real fish are not necessarily following these kinds of rules. And if we wanted to build a system, that's a lot of pressure. It's very hard to build that kind of perfection. So the question is, like, what is really needed? Like, could you get away with less? And what is the minimal amount of implicit coordination that you need in order to achieve these kind of behaviors? So this project inspired the Blue Swarm project in our group, which is to create miniature robots, about 10 centimeters size, so that we can have lots in the lab. And kind of like the kilobots, create a platform where we can program these kind of collective behaviors and investigate them. And of course, building 1,000 is completely out of the question. So if we get to 30, I will be very excited, because there isn't enough work in this area where we can build on. But the Bluebot, as it is right now, has three-dimensional motion. And so we use these very simple actuators called magnet and coil actuators, but they're good for making flippers, and you can completely submerge them in water, so there's no sealing requirements. So they're really easy to use. And in this way, we have multiple actuators, so this robot can turn in place, move up and down, even swim backwards, just with these pectoral, caudal, and dorsal fins. So it actually has like the kind of motion so that it could react to its neighbors. And then it has two cameras, two spherical cameras, so it has an almost 360-degree view, but of course with a lot of distortion and with a lot of computational limits. So, so instead, our robot has some blue lights, and this is how it recognizes other robots. So if you have, for example, just like some fish have schooling marks, our schooling marks are these LEDs. When you see these LEDs, you can estimate sort of how far a fish is and where it is in your view. But of course, you also have occlusion. So if there's a neighbor close to me, I actually can't see any of the other neighbors because they're obstructing my whole view. And most models don't even take that into account. It's just somehow everything is a point, and nothing occludes anything. So the reality is that we have noise and occlusion, and we also have still non-holonomic motion, even with all of these things put together. All right, so our current swarm actually has 7 robots. So I start by showing you a single one of these robots. So this is a tank in our lab, and this is one of the demos that we run. So there's a lure stick with a blue light on it, and the robot is following the lure stick. And so you can move the lure up and down and left and right, and it's basically trying to use vision only to follow wherever you move it. And so this is just showing off the fact that it can have this 3-dimensional motion, and that it can also see the lure at any point in its vision and see where it is. So this is a single robot. And right away, you can start to program sequences of behavior. So in this case, the robot is searching for this particular object in the center. When it sees it, it's starting to swim towards it. So it's homing in towards that structure. When it gets to the right distance, it aligns its heading so that the object is to its left, and then it starts to orbit or go around it. And the idea behind using this particular lure is that this sort of could represent another robot. So this is one of the first experiments we were doing to try and see if we could create sort of more complicated behaviors. All right, let's see, let's speed up in a second. It actually looks a lot to me like a carousel. Every time I watch this video, like, we should have tuned this better. But it was one of our early experiments trying to do this together. So once you have a robot that can react to the vision of other robots and can move in this way, we can start to program now collective behaviors where one robot reacts to another and the first one reacts to it. So this is just a simple version where you see 2 robots executing a kind of milling. They're basically trying to essentially follow each other and then ending up in this sort of circular one. So here's sort of a classic sort of example, the first 2 parts of Boyd's. You're doing dispersion. So you're trying to get to a certain distance away from each other. And then you're doing aggregation, where you're trying to equilibrate at a shorter distance. So you can aggregate and disperse and aggregate. So we're basically doing that sequence to see if we can get the robots to do this. And here is our sort of most fun experiment thus far, structure in motion. They are sort of milling, so there's actually a very simple rule where they're only sort of paying attention to things in front of them, and they're able to stabilize into these circles. And you'll see in a second, it's actually a cylinder. So it's not actually a circle. So in 3 dimensions, they're actually forming this bait ball-like structure at different depths. So even with these very, very simple sort of behaviors, we can already create systems that are getting close. And I think we'll learn a lot about how robust, what is the gap between what the theory tells us should happen and what's really going to happen with these robots. One of the sort of fun sort of endpoints I just wanted to show was that it actually turns out that there are fish, nocturnal fish, that school with blue lights, which we didn't know until we were presenting this, and a biologist gave us a video. So this is a video of flashlight fish. And what's interesting is there's growing evidence that not only do they use the lights to school, but they actually flash their lights sometimes in synchrony. And so they're actually passing messages in some way. I flash, then you flash, then I flash, and then we do something. And so it's really interesting if we also exploit that modality, what kinds of additional collective behaviors would be able to do in this system. But we're really sort of at the beginning of this. All right, so I've shown you very quickly this sort of whirlwind view of 4 different examples of collective intelligence in nature and that have inspired us to build robotic systems. And I will say, like, one of the things I love about doing this research is not only does it sort of span this idea of collective intelligence and mechanical intelligence, like, where is the intelligence coming from? Is it coming from the body? Is it coming from the physics of the interaction? Is it coming from the algorithms of interaction? We can play with all of those. And so it blurs the line between being a computer scientist or a mechanical engineer really nicely. But it also blurs the line between being an engineer and a scientist. So for every single one of these projects, we also now have a project where we're working with biologists in their domain to try and understand why fish school in certain ways, or how army ants actually build more complicated structures, and similarly with cells and termites. So it's a fun area to work in collective intelligence just because the number of people who are actually thinking about it crosses so many different disciplines. The other thing I was going to mention really quickly is that I chose these 4 examples to just tell you different kinds of structure. But it's also interesting, all of these 4 systems also use a very different kind of communication. So if you think of cells, you can think of very direct signaling, chemical signaling. Termites are communicating through the environment. Fish are communicating only through observation. And army ants are communicating through physical forces. So what's interesting is not all, even if all of the collectives solve similar problems, they've actually developed different methods of communication which may be more or less adapted to their environment. And I think this is also an interesting thing that I hadn't realized before until I started to actually give this talk. And I was like, oh, that's very interesting. But I think there's really more to be known about collective intelligence than we're really starting to lay our fingers on. All right, so what can thousands of individuals do together as a collective? Well, science. So everything that I've shown you here is the result of collective intelligence. Since I presented 4 projects, I didn't have time to go as much into related work, but our work is part of a much larger field of people who are looking at building swarm robots inspired by biology. And some of my favorite examples are actually here from MIT, including going back to Maya Matarik and sort of the nerd herd, which was, I don't know if people remember, but in Rod Brooks's group, some of the first experiments with ant-inspired robots. But everything from collective construction to underwater robots, there's just a really big community that is trying to push what we can do with these systems. And the work that I presented, of course, is collective intelligence as well, and this is the collective. And I'm really grateful and happy to work with this amazing set of people who have very diverse passions and diverse backgrounds. And I think together we really achieve, really transcend what any one of us could have achieved. So many of these projects I don't think any one of us could have done alone. So you saw Melinda, Mike with the kilobots, Kirsten, who built the Termites robots, and Justin, who worked with her on the algorithmic side, and Florian and Melvin, who are leading the project with the underwater swarm. All right, and I think that I'm going to sort of pass this one and end with that. So this is my collective intelligence lab, and we're pretty self-organized. All right, thank you. Now it's tight.
Thanks a lot. Any questions?
Thank you. Hi. Very excellent presentation. I have a question. So it seems that in these cases, the reward function is given by the compiler. I'm wondering if you are thinking of the robot itself has some intrinsic reward or value function. For instance, maybe in these cases of the bridge, for instance, the ants are getting a pleasure of
being stepped over?
Stepped over.
I love it.
And if they don't get that anymore, they move on and they try to be somewhere that they, you know.
Yeah, no, I think also, so I've thought a lot about this, and I'm not going to do justice to this here because of time, but also because I don't have a good answer. But I think that as long as we were looking at systems inspired by ants, the assumption is that ants are so closely related that they are purely altruistic. So if you are happy, I am happy. Even if I die, I am happy. You know, and so it's so. They are like an organism. They are like cells. Like nobody's saying, oh, this cell is fighting with this cell. No, the cells are working together. Once you get to fish, that's not necessarily true. They're not so closely related. So there is a lot of question, like, what is the reward function for participating and being part of a collective? And what is the reward function for being in the front and dealing with all of the drag and saving everyone behind you? Like, and it's unclear. And so in these systems, I think I've sort of sidestepped that issue. But I think one of the places you would want to put that back in is if you want these systems to learn, right? So let's say that these robots are making a bridge for a particular environment. But let's say the environment doesn't change. Like the same situation occurs again and again. Could they build the bridge faster? Could they build a better bridge? Could they learn which was the best bridge they built in the past and build only that one? in that case, you would want to have some sort of reward function that is explicitly being received so that the collective can learn. And all of these systems, it's known that the collectives can learn. In fact, many of the biologists will tell you they will not run an experiment on the same colony or the same group of animals too many times because the results start to change. They actually start to learn your experimental setup, right? And we know this about people, but I would have never thought this about fish and ants. And so we don't understand how could we build systems where we actually put in a reward function. I think that would be the really good place to bring that idea back in. But here, the reward function is all designed by us, pretty much.
Hello. Hey, Radhika. Amazing presentation, as always. A question for you about how you could see your work being taken forward into either the miniature or the macro realms. You mentioned Big Hero 6, so miniaturizing these types of collective swarms, or Walle, which is like a macro version.
Yeah.
What are the challenges on a technical level for miniaturization or for macro? Is it energy storage and density? Is it the size of the chips and the hardware that you're using?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, there's so many challenges, I don't know where to start. But I think this is where people who are working on individual robots and people who are working on swarms can really sort of work together. Because as we continually make single robots more capable, right, then I can also tell you like how much capability is needed and where for the collective to work. And so I think that many of the problems I face are actually problems that people with single robots face. It's just that we need to actually technologically solve them. So I can give you algorithms that don't require localization, then you don't have to work on localization. Sure. But I might still require some precision of movement, and I might want a soft body, and in that case, I'm going to interact. So I think as you go to the macro level, I think we have a lot of examples. Like we could think of people building together, but we can also think of automating all of the different machines that we've made to build together. Which of those is the right choice is really unclear, I think. Whether we should be mimicking animals or we should be mimicking, or just automating the things that we have. I haven't thought so much about the miniaturization as much, but there's a new person in my lab who's really interested. So she is constantly trying to take away motion and take away actuation. So can you have systems that are more like physics? You shake the system, and all the actuation is from the outside, and then the individuals are totally reacting on a stochastic way. I think you have to move to that stochastic way of thinking if you want to miniaturize it. That's my current feeling.
Cool, thank you.
So something that your robots have access to, which biological systems don't, is maybe self-replication, right? So what do the rules look like for your robots if they wanted to make more of themselves? How would you incentivize that? How would you stop it?
How would I stop it? Yeah, there's Greg Chirikian at Johns Hopkins from the very beginning of work on thinking about, he was one of the first people working on reconfigurable robots. He would host a class every year where undergrads had to design robots that could build copies of themselves. And it's amazing how many different kinds of designs you can make. And they all use Lego Mindstorm. So you literally had to build, your robot could move on a track, but it would basically pick up these things. And the idea was like one robot moves on a track, suddenly there's 2 robots moving on the track. Suddenly there's 4 robots moving on the track. So it was like really visceral that it was creating this thing. So I think there are ways to think about it, just like 3D printers printing 3D printers, right, as a mechanism to create it. But in my case, we're like pretty far. If we ourselves can build the robot reliably, I feel like we're still stuck there. How do you stop it? I mean, once we started, I don't know, but right now it's pretty stopped. It's so stopped. It's like I'm like, oh. It's true. I should probably think before I start it. I'm gonna go.
Oh. But
Or you can ask loudly.
Yeah. So I'm curious, a lot of the bridge and like macro scale construction of the smaller robots you were going on. One of the things you pointed out was that it's a messy amorphous rather than like a lattice or structural construction. In terms of building to safety standards for large structures, is there a way that the sort of algorithms can incorporate that, or are you thinking more that maybe they're not as resilient structures, but they're not used in cases where you need them to be?
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons I got interested in amorphous structures for the first time was failures that we had with the Termites project. So the Termites project is trying to build things in these lattices. You make one mistake, and the correction is not simple because a lattice has a defect, and then the defect keeps on propagating. But termites, they build with mud, so if they leave a hole, they just come back and they plug it, right? And so there are places where we as humans use that technique. And the one that I think everybody knows is building with sandbags. So you want to build something fast and you want to build something strong. It actually has to obey a safety standard, which is protect everybody from the flood. So it's not like you don't have a really hard spec there. But you can build fast, and unskilled people can get together and build. And so I think one of the things I like about amorphous structures is that maybe the first settings where we're really going to want to use that is where we have to send in unskilled robots or unskilled people, or unskilled robots and unskilled people, and where perhaps the materials available to you are not precise materials. They could even be found materials, right? It could be that you're in the desert and you basically have to build out of, whatever is available to you there, or you're somewhere and there's trees and you have to build out of sticks. But we're actually starting to study how beavers build. And for me, that's, if you think of levees and you think of the dams that beavers build, they're building it, they're not taking sandbags, they're just showing up there, cutting down material, using sticks, mud, and, rocks to basically create super strong structures that grow over time. And some of these have lasted like 50 years, right? So our bridges are crumbling. So I don't know, I think we think of animal structures as not living up to a safety standard. And maybe that's true from our perspective, but the longevity of those structures and the self-repair of some of those structures is really incredible. So I don't know that like tomorrow we're going to be acceptable to live in a termite mound or like something like that, but I do think there is a lot to learn, and maybe it can change the way we do construction.
Maybe one more quick question, it's quite late, and then we can continue the discussion on the other room with food and drinks, if that's okay.
Since
All
I
right,
have the
Nils.
mic.
You
yeah,
got
one
the
more.
mic.
And it's also kind of related to his question. Do you think, specifically in the case of the army ants, do you think they're optimizing for redundancy because you said the structure was inefficient, but maybe it's not inefficient, it's just redundant, or are they so small that they don't care about redundancy? Like a fall is totally reasonable.
I think that the trick is defining efficiency. So in their case, they are very efficient, which is that they're building really fast. The idea is that the reason they build bridges is because they're raiding something else and they're trying to get the loot back to their house as fast as possible. And so the straightest, widest path is the best possible case. So they're very efficiently constructing that. So my feeling is that the messiness and the amorphousness of it is because they're making speed efficient and not material use efficient. And so they have a lot of ants. Like I think asking why they evolved so many ants, maybe they have redundancy for other reasons, like it's useful for raiding and it's useful for, like some of these colonies are tremendously large. So maybe it's just you have a lot of people, so it's okay to use them, right? So I don't know, but I think speed is the most important factor that they think. The other thing is if you really were truly redundant, you might just leave the bridge there, right? But they actually recover the individuals. So every time they build structures, they actually recover it back. And so there is some discussion in this group that maybe there is a cost function. Like every time I put down an ant, that's an ant who could have been bringing back food. And so in fact, there still is an efficiency where I don't want to put down all of my material. So I don't want to like make this massive bridge, and I don't want to leave it there longer than necessary. So maybe there is some other metric also there where material cost matters. But at least in the small version that we're doing, we're just trying to prove that congestion can be a signal that can be alleviated, and that's the part that we are at now. But yeah, they create an entire nest out of their own bodies, and one of Mike Rubenstein, who I mentioned, he and Simone recently took an X-ray machine out there, and they've actually X-rayed these much larger structures, and they're going to try and understand how these larger structures are formed. So I think that more and more is going to happen in this. We're going to understand more and more about these areas. All right.
All right.
All right.